The ocean had been angry for weeks. Waves taller than houses crashed against the rocky coastline, tearing at the cliffs, pulling at the earth, swallowing everything in their path. When the storm finally broke, the people of the small coastal village emerged from their homes, blinking in the pale morning light, expecting to see the familiar stretch of golden sand they had known their entire lives. Instead, they saw a nightmare: 10,000 plastic bottles, maybe more. They covered the beach like a second tide, a grotesque rainbow of blues and greens and clear, catching the sunlight and throwing it back in a million shattered prisms. The sand was gone. The shells were gone. The driftwood that children collected for their beach fires was buried under mountains of discarded containers that had traveled across entire oceans to die on this one stretch of shore. The villagers stood at the edge of the road, staring. No one moved. No one knew what to do. The local council sent a man in a truck. He drove to the end of the access road, looked at the scale of what lay before him, and turned around. He told the mayor it would cost more than the village's annual budget just to haul the bottles to a landfill. And where would they go then? Another beach? Another ocean? The mayor shrugged. Nature's problem now, he said, but it wasn't nature's problem. It was Maya's. Her cottage sat at the very end of the beach, the last house before the cliffs rose up and the land turned wild. She had inherited it from her grandmother, a woman who had fished these waters for 60 years, and who had taught Maya that the ocean gives and the ocean takes, but it never, ever forgets. Maya stood on her porch that first morning, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, and watched the bottles glint in the sun. She was 32 years old. She had no job, no savings, no plan. What she had was a beach full of garbage and a grandmother's voice in her head saying, "The ocean doesn't make mistakes, child. It makes opportunities. You just have to be brave enough to see them." The first bottle she picked up was blue, a cheap water bottle, the label long since worn away by salt and sun. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the rough texture of the weathered plastic, and something shifted in her chest. Not sadness, not anger. Curiosity. What if these weren't trash? What if they were material? She spent that entire day walking the beach, filling a single wheelbarrow with bottles. Her neighbors watched from their windows. Some laughed. One man, old Mr. Henderson, who owned the bait shop, called out to her, "Waste of time, Maya. Tide'll just bring more." She didn't answer. She was looking at the bottles differently now. Not as pollution, as possibility. That night, she cut her first bottle apart with kitchen scissors. The plastic was tougher than she expected, resistant, unwilling to yield. She sliced her finger, blood welled up, dark against the blue plastic, and she stared at it for a long moment. Then she bandaged her hand and tried again. By midnight, she had a single flat sheet of plastic. It was warped, uneven, ugly. She held it up to the light of her grandmother's old oil lamp and saw the way the flame flickered through it, turning the blue into something deep and oceanic, beautiful. She didn't sleep. She cut more bottles, flattened them, pressed them between heavy books to smooth the curves. By dawn, she had a stack of 20 plastic sheets, each one a different shade, each one carrying the ghost of its journey across the sea. The first bag she made was terrible. She tried to sew the plastic sheets together with fishing line, but the needle kept slipping, the plastic tearing where she didn't want it to tear, holding firm where she needed it to bend. The bag looked like something a child might make in a crafts class. Lopsided, mismatched, wrong. She threw it in the corner and went to bed. She woke 3 hours later and pulled it back out. It wasn't right, but it was a beginning. For 3 weeks, Maya did nothing but collect bottles and experiment. She learned that some plastics melted when heated, others curled, others turned brittle and cracked. She learned that the bottles from different countries She could tell by the faint traces of labels, the shape of the caps, the thickness of the walls, behaved differently under stress. She filled her grandmother's old workshop, a shed behind the cottage that hadn't been opened in a decade. The smell of melting plastic mixed with salt air and wood smoke. Her clothes carried the scent permanently. Her hands developed calluses that never quite healed. The second bag was better. She had figured out that if she layered the plastic sheets and pressed them together with heat, not fire but controlled, patient warmth, they fused into something stronger. A composite material, flexible but durable, waterproof but soft to the touch. The bag had panels of deep ocean blue, seafoam green, and clear crystal that caught the light. She added a strap made from braided fishing net she found tangled in the rocks. The closure was a piece of driftwood, smoothed by years of tumbling in the surf. She carried it to the village market on a Saturday morning. People stared, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because they recognized the bottles. "Is that from the beach?" asked Mrs. Chen, who ran the bakery. Maya nodded. "It's lovely," Mrs. Chen said, and she meant it. She didn't buy it. No one did. Maya went home with the bag still on her shoulder and a new understanding. Beauty wasn't enough. The bag needed a story. People needed to understand what they were looking at, where it came from, why it mattered. She spent the next week not making bags, but writing. She wrote about the storm, about the bottles, about her grandmother and the ocean, and the way the tide brings gifts if you know how to receive them. She wrote about the calluses on her hands and the smell of melting plastic and the moment when trash became treasure. She printed her story on handmade paper, recycled, of course, from the cardboard boxes that washed up with the bottles, and tied one to every bag she made. The next market day, she sold 3 to tourists, people from the city who didn't know about the storm, who hadn't seen the beach covered in garbage, who looked at Maya's bags and saw something exotic and meaningful. They read her story while she watched, their expression shifting from curiosity to wonder to something that looked almost like hope. A woman with silver hair and expensive sunglasses bought the blue and green bag Maya had carried that first day. She paid full price without bargaining, which never happened at the village market. "My daughter runs a boutique in London," she said. "She would love these. Do you have a card?" Maya didn't have a card. She didn't have a business. She had a cottage full of plastic bottles and a shed that smelled like melted dreams. But she found a pen and wrote her phone number on a scrap of paper, and the woman tucked it into her wallet with the same care she had used to handle the bag. 3 weeks later, Maya received an email. The daughter's name was Eleanor. Her boutique was small but respected, located in a neighborhood where people paid extra for things that came with stories. She wanted 50 bags, different sizes, different colors. She would pay up front. Maya read the email 17 times. Then she walked to the beach and started collecting bottles. 50 bags required more plastic than she had ever processed. She worked 18 hours a day, cutting and flattening and fusing and sewing. Her fingers bled again, the cuts reopening, new ones joining them. She slept in 2-hour shifts on a mattress on the workshop floor, waking to the smell of plastic and the sound of waves. The villagers thought she had lost her mind. Mr. Henderson told anyone who would listen that Maya had snapped, that the garbage had gotten to her, that someone should call her family and have her taken somewhere she could get help. Her family was dead. Her grandmother's cottage was all she had. And these bottles, these hated, beautiful bottles, were all she had left to hold on to. She delivered the 50 bags on a Tuesday morning, packed in boxes made from more salvaged cardboard, each one wrapped in tissue paper she had pressed from seaweed pulp. Eleanor met her at the boutique, a narrow storefront with exposed brick and plants in every window. She opened the first box. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she opened a second box, and a third. "These are art," she said finally. "These aren't bags. These are art that happens to carry things." She sold them all in 6 weeks at prices Maya had never imagined. Eleanor placed another order, 200 bags. And she had a question. "Can you make other things?" Maya thought about the bottles in her workshop, the colors, the possibilities, the way the plastic bent and melted and transformed under her hands. "Yes," she said. "I can make anything." She started with home decor, wall panels made from fused plastic, layered like sedimentary rock, each layer telling the story of a different bottle's journey. Lamps with shades that cast ocean-colored light across rooms, vases that held flowers with water that seemed to glow from within, then jewelry, earrings light as feathers made from the thinnest sheets of clear plastic, catching light and throwing rainbows. Necklaces of braided plastic cord, interwoven with shells and sea glass. Bracelets that clicked softly against each other, sounding like waves on pebbles. Then furniture. A chair made from bottles melted and molded into flowing curves, strong enough to hold weight, beautiful enough to be the centerpiece of a room. A table with a surface of compressed plastic that looked like frozen ocean, depths within depths, colors shifting as you moved around it. Each piece came with a story, not Maya's story anymore, but the story of the bottles themselves, where they came from, how far they traveled, what they had seen on their journey across the water. She researched shipping routes and ocean currents, traced labels back to manufacturers in countries she had never visited, imagined the hands that had held these bottles before the ocean claimed them. Her workshop grew. She hired 2 women from the village, young mothers who needed work that fit around their children's schedules. She taught them to cut and flatten and fuse. She taught them to see the beauty in what others called trash. Mr. Henderson stopped laughing. He started collecting bottles from the beach and leaving them in stacks outside her workshop door. He never said anything, just appeared in the morning with his wheelbarrow, unloaded, and left. Maya found him one day, standing at the edge of her property, looking at the new sign she had hung above the workshop door. Tidal. The name came to her in a dream, her grandmother's voice saying it over and over until she woke with it on her lips. Tidal. Because the ocean gives and takes. Because everything comes back eventually. Because you never know what the tide will bring. "It's good work you're doing," Mr. Henderson said. It was the closest he would ever come to an apology. The first magazine article appeared 6 months later, a design publication from New York. A full-page spread with photographs of Maya's workshop, her hands working the plastic, her face turned toward the ocean through the workshop window. The headline called her the alchemist of trash. Orders exploded, not dozens, hundreds. From stores in Paris and Tokyo and Sydney, from hotels that wanted her wall panels in their lobbies, from restaurants that wanted her lamps hanging above their tables, from individuals who had read her story and wanted to own a piece of something that felt like hope. Maya hired more people, 10, then 20, then 50. She bought the abandoned fish processing plant at the edge of the village, the one that had closed when the fish stocks collapsed, and turned it into a factory that didn't feel like a factory. Light poured through windows she installed along the roof. Plants grew in corners. The smell of plastic was still there, but now it mixed with coffee and conversation, and the sound of music playing from someone's phone. She never stopped going to the beach. Every morning, before the sun cleared the horizon, she walked the shoreline with a bag on her shoulder, collecting bottles. Not because she needed them. She had suppliers now, contracts with recycling centers up and down the coast, agreements with shipping companies to collect the plastic that accumulated in their harbors. She went because the beach was where it started, because the bottles reminded her of what was possible, because her grandmother was right. The ocean doesn't make mistakes. 3 years after the storm, Maya stood in the center of her new showroom in London, a space larger than her entire cottage, surrounded by pieces that had started as garbage on a beach and were now displayed like museum artifacts. A man approached her. He wore a suit that cost more than her first year of sales. He carried a briefcase made from leather that had never seen an ocean. He looked at the wall panel behind her, a massive piece called the 10th Wave, made from exactly 1,000 bottles, each one representing 1,000 more that still floated in the sea. "I'm from a hotel chain," he said. "We have properties in 40 countries. We're redesigning all of them. We want everything to be sustainable. We want your work in every room." Maya looked at him. Why? It wasn't the question he expected. He blinked, confused by a business owner who didn't immediately start negotiating. Because our guests care about the environment. Because this is beautiful. Because it tells a story. Maya finished. "Yes, and what story do you want to tell?" He didn't have an answer, not then. But Maya gave him one anyway. She told him about the storm, about the 10,000 bottles, about the morning she stood on her porch with cold tea in her hands and saw not garbage, but possibility. She told him about her grandmother and the ocean and the way the tide brings gifts if you're brave enough to see them. She told him about Mr. Henderson and his wheelbarrow, about Eleanor and her boutique, about the women in her factory who had never had jobs before, who now supported their families, who brought their children to work on school holidays and taught them to see beauty in broken things. By the time she finished, the man from the hotel chain was crying. He didn't get the contract that day. Maya made him wait. She made him come to the beach, made him walk the shoreline at dawn, made him pick up a bottle and hold it in his hands and tell her what he saw. He saw trash, then he saw color, then he saw journey, then he saw possibility. "Now," Maya said, "you can tell the story." The contract was signed on the beach, with the sound of waves as witness and a gull crying overhead. It was the largest deal she had ever made. It would put her work in 10,000 rooms across 40 countries. 10,000 rooms, 10,000 bottles. The symmetry made her laugh out loud. There on the sand, while the hotel man looked at her like she was crazy. She had to be. 5 years after the storm, Maya stood at the window of her office, a room in the old fish plant with a view of the harbor, and watched a ship come in, not a fishing boat, a cargo vessel, massive and white, with a name painted on the bow, in letters she couldn't read from this distance. It carried something precious, something that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Plastic, not bottles this time, but industrial waste, scraps from manufacturing plants, offcuts from packaging facilities, material that had no purpose, no value, no place in the world, except here, except with her. She had built something the world had never seen before. A supply chain that ran backward, collecting what others discarded and turning it into what others desired. A business model that didn't just reduce waste, but eliminated the concept entirely. The ship carried 50 tons of plastic scrap. It would become wall panels for a hotel in Dubai, lamps for a restaurant in Singapore, bags for a store in Milan, jewelry for a museum gift shop in New York. Every piece came with a number, not a price. A number that told you exactly how much plastic had been removed from the ocean to create it. How many bottles, how many caps, how many fragments of a world that had thrown them away. The customers didn't just buy beauty, they bought redemption. Maya walked down to the dock as the ship was tying up. The captain was a woman named Ingrid, Norwegian, with weathered skin and hands that knew ropes the way Maya's knew plastic. "You know what they call you in Rotterdam?" Ingrid asked. What? The queen of garbage? Maya laughed. I prefer Tidal. So do they. That's why they call you that. The unloading took 3 days. Maya worked alongside her crew, sorting the plastic by type and color and condition, her hands moving with the automatic precision of years of practice. She found a bottle cap from a brand she recognized, a soda she had drunk as a child, and she held it for a moment before adding it to the pile. Everything comes back. Everything has value. You just have to be brave enough to see it. The expansion happened faster than she planned. Not because she sought it, but because the world demanded it. Climate change had stopped being a theoretical concern and become a daily reality. Consumers wanted, needed, to believe that their purchases mattered, that their money could vote for a different kind of world. Maya gave them that belief, not through marketing, not through slogans, through truth. Every piece she made was traceable, every bottle accounted for, every step of the process documented and shared, from collection to creation to the moment it arrived in someone's home. She opened workshops in 3 more coastal villages, places that had been dying as fishing declined, places where young people left and never returned. She hired locally, trained locally, built factories that looked like community centers, with gardens and childcare and spaces for art and music. The mayor who had called it nature's problem came to her for a job. She gave him one waste management coordinator, responsible for ensuring that every scrap of plastic that entered her facilities left as something beautiful. He cried when she told him. She pretended not to notice. Mr. Henderson died in his sleep 2 years after he started bringing her bottles. Maya found the wheelbarrow at her door one morning, full as always, but the old man wasn't there. She went to his cottage and found him in his chair, peaceful, a photograph of his late wife in his hands. At the funeral, she learned that he had left her his bait shop, the building, the inventory, the name over the door. Everything. She turned it into a museum, not of fish, of transformation. The first bag she ever made sat in a glass case, terrible and lopsided and perfect. Beside it, the 50th bag, the one Eleanor had bought, the one that started everything. The wall panels and lamps and jewelry and furniture that had come after, each piece labeled with its story, its origin, its journey from trash to treasure. People came from all over the world. They stood in front of that first bag and they cried, not because it was beautiful, because it was proof. Proof that one person with nothing but garbage and determination could change everything. 10 years after the storm, Maya stood on the same porch where she had held that cold cup of tea, watching the same ocean that had tried to drown her beach in plastic. The beach was clean now, not because the bottles had stopped coming. They hadn't. They never would. The world was still producing plastic faster than it could be managed. But because Maya had created something that made the bottles valuable, villages up and down the coast competed to collect them. Fishermen who had once thrown plastic back into the water now saved it for her. Children who had once played among the garbage now ran beach cleanups, knowing that every bottle they found was worth something. The ocean was still angry. It would always be angry, wounded by centuries of abuse, bleeding microplastics into the food chain, rising up to swallow islands and cities. But here, on this one stretch of shore, something had changed. Maya sipped her tea, hot this time, not cold, and watched a gull settle on the sand where 10,000 bottles had once lain. Her phone buzzed, a message from her CFO, a number she didn't want to hear but needed to know. Revenue for the year. She looked at it, then she looked at the ocean, then she laughed. $1 million. No, more than that. Much more. Her little cottage industry, her mad experiment with kitchen scissors and melted plastic and a grandmother's voice in her head, had become an empire. Tidal was now in 20 countries, 3,000 employees, factories that processed not just ocean plastic but industrial waste, agricultural runoff, construction debris, anything that had been discarded, anything that had lost its purpose, anything that the world had decided was worthless. Maya gave it worth. She gave it beauty. She gave it story. And the world, desperate for stories that ended in hope, bought every word. But the money wasn't what mattered. Not to her. What mattered was the number she kept on a chalkboard in her office, updated every morning, written in her own hand. 147 million. That was how many bottles had been removed from the ocean since she picked up that first blue one. 147 million pieces of plastic that would never choke a sea turtle, never break down into microplastics, never float in the great garbage patches that spun in the ocean's gyres. They were bags now, lamps, chairs, homes, hope. She finished her tea and walked down to the beach. The sand was warm under her feet, the same sand that had been buried under garbage a decade ago. She walked to the water's edge, where the waves hissed and retreated, and she waited. The tide was coming in. It always came in, and with it, riding the foam and the seaweed and the salt, a single bottle, clear, waiting. Maya bent down and picked it up. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the familiar rough texture, seeing the way the sunlight caught and shattered through the plastic. Beautiful. She tucked it into her bag and walked back up the beach toward the workshop that had started in her grandmother's shed and was now a campus of buildings that employed half the village. Tomorrow, this bottle would become something else, a pendant, maybe, a tile for a mosaic, a piece of a chair that someone would sit in while they told their children about the woman who turned garbage into gold. The ocean had tried to bury her in trash. Instead, it had given her the materials to build a cathedral. And Maya, walking up the beach with a bottle in her bag and the sun on her face, knew that the tide would bring more. It always brought more, and she would always be there, waiting, ready to see what others called ruin and recognize it for what it truly was, opportunity-drawn material. A gift from the sea. She reached her cottage and paused at the door, looking back one last time at the water. "Thank you," she whispered. The ocean didn't answer. It didn't need to. The proof was in her hands. The proof was in every home that held her work, every person who wore her jewelry, every child who learned that trash was just treasure that hadn't found its purpose yet. The proof was in the clean sand and the crying gulls and the wheelbarrow that still sat by her door waiting to be filled. Maya went inside. She had work to do. The tide was coming in, and she had never been more ready. The sun climbed higher now, burning off the morning mist that clung to the cliffs. Maya moved through her workshop, running her fingers along tables where women sat cutting plastic with the same kitchen scissors she had used that first night. Only now the scissors were sharper. The tables were proper workbenches, and the women wore aprons with the Tidal logo stitched over their hearts. A young girl, no more than 16, looked up as Maya passed. Her name was Aisha, and she had come from a village 2 hours north, fleeing a home where no one believed girls should work. Maya had found her sleeping on the beach one morning, huddled under a tarp made from fused plastic bags. Now Aisha was one of the best cutters in the factory, her hands steady and sure, her eyes seeing patterns in the plastic that even Maya missed. "The new shipment from Indonesia," Aisha said, pointing to a crate in the corner. "The blue ones, they're different, thicker. They make the light do strange things." Maya opened the crate and pulled out a bottle. Aisha was right. The plastic was denser, carrying within it swirls of white that looked like clouds trapped in blue sky. She held it up to the window, and the morning sun turned it into something that looked like a piece of the heavens had fallen into her hands. "Save these," she said. "These are special." Aisha nodded, already sorting the bottles into a separate bin, her movements quick and precise. Maya watched her for a moment, remembering when she had been the only one in this room, when the silence had been broken only by the sound of waves and her own breathing. Now there was laughter and music and the hum of machines that Maya had designed herself, built from salvaged parts and stubborn imagination. Machines that pressed plastic into sheets smoother than glass. Machines that cut with laser precision. Machines that turned what had been manual labor into something that could scale, that could reach the thousands, the millions. But Maya still cut by hand sometimes. Late at night, when the factory was empty, she would sit at her old workbench with a single bottle and a pair of scissors, and she would make something small. A pendant, a keychain, a tiny sculpture that no one would ever buy. She needed to remember. Needed to feel the resistance of the plastic, the way it fought back before it yielded. Needed to remember that everything worth making started with struggle. The afternoon brought rain, sudden and heavy, drumming against the factory roof in a rhythm that made Maya think of her grandmother's stories about storms at sea. She stood at the loading dock, watching the water turn the dirt road into mud, watching her workers pull tarps over crates of finished products bound for ports she had never seen. A truck pulled up, splashing through the puddles, and a man jumped out with a clipboard and an umbrella that did nothing to keep him dry. "Delivery from the Mediterranean Cleanup Project," he shouted over the rain. 40 tons, mixed plastics. They said you'd know what to do with it. Maya signed his clipboard and watched the truck back up to the loading bay. 40 tons of garbage that someone else had pulled from the sea, trusting her to give it purpose. The responsibility still staggered her, even after all these years. Every bottle, every fragment, every piece of driftwood and rope and netting that arrived at her door was a promise she had made to the ocean. She would not waste it. She would not fail it. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving the air clean and sharp with the smell of wet earth. Maya walked the perimeter of the property, past the gardens where employees grew vegetables between shifts, past the playground where children played while their mothers worked, past the solar panels that powered everything the sun could give. At the far edge of the land, where the factory met the wild, she had planted a tree, not just any tree. An oak grown from an acorn she had found in the pocket of an old coat that had washed up on the beach. It was small still, barely taller than she was, but its leaves were broad and green and stubborn. She touched its bark, rough and alive beneath her fingers. "Growing," she said to it. The tree didn't answer, but a breeze moved through its leaves, and Maya chose to believe that was enough. Evening came slowly in summer, the light lingering like it didn't want to leave. Maya sat on her porch with a new cup of tea, watching the sky turn the colors of her best work: deep blue, burning orange, clear crystal fading to black. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a photograph from the museum, the one in Mr. Henderson's old bait shop. A child, maybe 8 years old, standing in front of that terrible first bag, pointing at it with an expression of wonder. The caption read, "She asked if she could touch it. I said yes." She cried. Maya stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she saved it. Then she finished her tea. The stars were coming out now, pricking holes in the darkening sky. Maya thought about the bottles floating in the ocean right now, riding currents she had mapped and studied, traveling toward shores where people would find them and wonder what to do. Some of those bottles would end up with her. Others would end up with people she had never met. Makers and artists and dreamers who had seen her story and started their own. The idea of Tidal had spread beyond anything she could control, beyond anything she had planned. There were Tidal workshops in Indonesia now, in Kenya, in Chile. People she had never spoken to using her methods, her philosophy, turning their own garbage into their own gold. She hadn't built a business. She had started a movement. And movements, like tides, went where they wanted. Maya stood and stretched, her back cracking in the way it did when she had been sitting too long. She was 42 now, 10 years older than the woman who had picked up that first blue bottle. Her hands were scarred. Her shoulders carried the weight of 3,000 employees and 147 million bottles, and her heart was fuller than it had ever been. She walked inside, past the photographs on her walls. Her grandmother on a fishing boat, young and fierce. Eleanor at the boutique opening, holding a Tidal bag like a trophy. Mr. Henderson with his wheelbarrow, caught in a moment of rare smiling. Aisha on her first day, terrified and determined. The cottage was small, smaller than it needed to be for someone of her means. She could have bought a mansion, could have lived in a penthouse in London or a villa in Tuscany. But this cottage, with its salt-stained walls and its view of the ocean and its workshop that still smelled of melted plastic, was where she belonged. This was where it had started. This was where it would always start. She lay down on the same mattress she had used during those first desperate weeks, the one on the workshop floor, and she listened to the waves through the open window. They sounded the same as they had 10 years ago, the same as they had sounded when her grandmother was young, the same as they would sound long after Maya was gone. The ocean doesn't make mistakes. It makes opportunities. You just have to be brave enough to see them. Maya closed her eyes. Tomorrow the tide would bring more, and she would be ready. She always was. The morning sun found her still awake, staring at the ceiling beams her grandfather had carved a lifetime ago. She had not slept, but she did not feel tired. There was a restlessness in her bones, the same feeling that had driven her to pick up that first bottle, the same hunger that had kept her cutting and fusing and dreaming when everyone else had gone to bed. She rose and dressed in the same clothes she had worn for a decade. Sturdy trousers, a worn sweater, boots that had walked 1,000 miles of shoreline. She did not own a dress, did not own jewelry except the pendant she had made from the first perfect sheet of plastic, the one that hung around her neck on a cord of braided fishing line. The factory was quiet when she arrived, the night shift gone home, the day shift not yet arrived. She walked through the empty halls, her footsteps echoing off walls that had once been white and were now stained with the colors of 1,000 bottles. Blue fingerprints, green smudges, clear streaks where light had passed through plastic and left its mark. In the design room, she found the sketches Aisha had left on the table. New ideas, new forms. A chandelier made from suspended bottles that would cast rainbows across a ballroom. A floor made from compressed plastic that would feel like walking on frozen water. A dress, impossibly, made from woven plastic threads that would shimmer like scales on a fish. Maya smiled. The next generation was already dreaming bigger than she had. She took a blank sheet of paper and a pencil worn down to a stub, and she began to draw. Not a product, not something that would be made or sold or shipped across oceans. A map. A map of every beach she had ever walked, every village that had sent her bottles, every person who had touched her work and been changed by it. She drew lines connecting them all. Threads of influence and inspiration that wrapped around the globe like a net catching falling stars. When she finished, the sun was high and the factory was alive with the sounds of people arriving, of machines starting up, of music playing from someone's phone. She folded the map carefully and tucked it into her pocket. It was not a business plan. It was a love letter to the ocean, to the garbage. To every person who had ever looked at something broken and seen something beautiful. She walked out into the main floor, where Aisha was already at her station, where the new machines were humming to life, where the smell of coffee mixed with the smell of plastic and possibility. "What are we making today?" someone asked. Maya looked at the crate of Indonesian bottles, the ones with clouds trapped inside them. She looked at the map in her pocket. She looked at the ocean through the factory windows, blue and endless and full of secrets. "Everything," she said, and they did.